Okay, the floor is yours, Wilma.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. I'm Wilma Liebman, and on behalf of the leadership of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, I welcome our virtual audience to this first of a series of weekly webinars on the subject of labor and employment relations during the COVID-19 pandemic. Like nothing that we have seen in our lifetimes, this crisis has placed workers and their well-being prominently in our minds and in the public discourse. We hope that all of you and your families are well, managing this very troubling moment. I will become president-elect of LERA in June. For those of you less familiar with LERA, we urge you to learn more and join this unique multidisciplinary community where even in today's polarized climate, labor, management, and government, academics, advocates, and neutrals come together, making LERA an ideal setting for dialogue about a way forward at this uncertain historical moment. We encourage you to participate in as many of the upcoming webinars as you can. They are organized around different sectors, for example, healthcare, construction, higher education, and around different themes, such as workplace issues arising under labor and employment laws, low wage and gig workers, journalists covering work during this crisis, and policy issues like today's program. And please take a look at the LERA website and attend our virtual annual meeting in June. I especially wish to thank LERA Executive Director Emily Smith and Marketing Coordinator Bernadette Tiemann, whose energy and creativity made this webinar series a reality. I also welcome and thank my very distinguished co-panelists today. We cover an 8-hour time span. We have 2 LERA past presidents, both in the Boston area, our moderator Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld and Tom Kochan. Their collaborative thinking was the impetus for this webinar series. I also welcome and thank Cathy Feingold, who is like me in Washington, D.C., Alan Wild in the UK, somewhere near Oxford, I think, and Sandy Jacoby in Los Angeles. Now I turn to Joel to moderate our program.
Thank you, Wilma. And my job is, of course, to maintain the flow and to be of service, particularly during the Q&A dialogue. I also have slides on my desktop, which I will soon share, and will iterate between you're seeing people speaking and in some cases seeing slides that they're using. But it's truly an honor and a delight to launch this webinar series. And I see we have over 220 people already signed in, which is phenomenal. And I am now sharing my desktop. You can see that this is the topic for this forum, and the speakers are listed in the order in which that they will be presenting. We'll start with Tom Kochan, then we'll hear from Cathy Feingold, Alan Wild, Sandy Jacoby, and Wilma Liebman, who launched us. We'll have some concluding comments before we open it up to the LERA community. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom. I will say, though, before that these slides will be available through LERA as the forums for dialogue emerge in this post-COVID crisis. But Tom, prompted by you, I'll start moving the slides forward, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. Well, it's a delight to be with my great colleagues and with all of you on this LERA webinar. As Wilma has said, I can't think of an organization better suited to address these issues. And I'm privileged to be a part of this. And I want to make 3 quick points in starting this off. I believe that we can learn from this crisis, and we can really use the crisis as an opportunity to lay the foundation for a new social contract. And so to start with, it's so clear that we obviously need to fill the holes in the safety net that are laid bare by this crisis. And I've listed a number of them here. That it's not an exhaustive list, but it starts with the recognition that the system of tying healthcare and healthcare coverage and insurance to one's job has outlived its usefulness, perhaps a long time ago. We have to fix that problem. There are a variety of ways to do that, but we have to really get on with that task. Secondly, this has also shown how embarrassing it is for our country to be the last country in the democratic mix of countries around the world to not have a paid and family leave or a paid sick leave policy. We've had to put in temporary fixes for that. They're only temporary, they're only partial. We need to get on with addressing that issue. Other countries around the world, particularly in Europe, were much better at promoting employment continuity rather than going to layoffs. Short-time work processes and working on together as social partners has shown us that we could do better than what we have done in this emergency. Clearly, we have extended unemployment insurance partially to gig workers and people outside of the system, but we have to expand that even further to really deal with all people who lose their jobs. And then we are going through what is destined to be the biggest redeployment of the workforce in our economy in our lifetime. Not since World War II, when we had to have more and more people, women in particular, come into the labor force to make up for the people who are going off to fight the war. Well, we have a war of illness now, and we're going to have a long-term challenge in redeploying people to fill the gaps behind our emergency workers. I'll say more about that in a moment. Finally here, I really want to bring up the point that we have a very embarrassing situation, not addressing the needs of our immigrants who are doing so much of the essential work today. It's a tragedy that they are being excluded from the benefits that the rest of us have an opportunity to draw on, and that they're afraid to leave their home because of deportation threats. It's time to fix the immigrant problem. But in addition to these substantive issues, I think for us in LERA, this identifies something we've known for a long time, that we have to fill the void in worker voice. Just look at what's happening in the short run now, where workers are filing thousands of complaints with OSHA and getting no response, and it's left to the employers to fix the problems. Some employers are doing an outstanding job of addressing these needs, but the reality is that workers know what's safe and what isn't, and they need to be consulting. They need a universal right to a voice at work that goes way beyond our collective bargaining statutes. Where unions and collective bargaining exist, there's a lot of good dialogue and negotiations of safety practices, of hero pay, and various other kinds of adjustments. But we need to make sure that that extends to everybody in our society. We should do that on an emergency basis by allowing governors in the states to do what they need to do to help redeploy the workforce. But then once we get through this crisis, let's really learn that it's time, more than time, to fix our labor policies, to update them to meet the needs of the modern economy, the modern workforce. That does mean fixing the basics of labor law to give everyone who wants it access to collective bargaining, but we have to open up our laws to a much more fundamental forms of representation. Workers today want a voice in helping to improve their operations, to take care of issues at the workplace. They want something akin to the European Works Councils to consult on the full array of issues of concern to them. And yes, they probably also need a voice at the corporate governance level on boards of directors. So let's experiment with those. Let's find ways to do that. Let's also encourage the new forms of worker mobilization happening all around the country with advocacy groups outside of our labor law. It's time to get on with this. Let me close with a call for all of us to work together, to bring all of the stakeholders together, to deliberate on the points that I've just raised and ones that are important to others that I haven't covered here. It's time to build a new social contract governing work, and it's time for all of us to take the leadership in bringing these points to bear in public dialogue. So thank you for listening, and let's go to work.
Well, thank you, Tom. That's a great launch into this conversation. I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Cathy, who represents Labor Voice in this webinar. Cathy.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to the organizers from LERA. By way of introduction, my name is Cathy Feingold. I'm going to wear two hats today. I am both the International Director at the AFL-CIO. I'm also the Deputy President of the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global union body representing over 200 million workers. So in my limited time, I'm going to try to cover both the US and the global. What we know is that we are trying to build a response on top of a system that's been broken for workers in the US and globally. The crisis, of course, has underscored all the things that Tom has shown us, the things that are broken, that this has been a system built on the exploitation of workers. And so I join with him in saying that we too, both from the AFL-CIO and globally, call for a new social contract, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also know that existing inequalities are becoming worse along race, gender, migration status. The US, I know many are following, the pandemic is disproportionately affecting African Americans and immigrants. We're seeing the rise of xenophobia against Asian Americans. So the question is what to do. How do we use this crisis as a time to drive positive structural change and social change and increase the level of fairness and democracy in our economy? So let me lay out 4 main points that I think we should be applying at the local, national, and global levels. First, we should be meeting the immediate needs of workers. And that's what unions are doing around the world and in our own communities here in the US. We're organizing food banks and shelter and income support and healthcare needs. The second, we need to be addressing the immediate economic crisis. We need the policy prescriptions to maintain wages and employment, make sure we're rescuing threatened sectors, and make sure everyone's getting the support they need. The third part, and we haven't even gotten there yet, but we need to be thinking about this now, is building the future worker-friendly and sustainable economy. We will need to formulate a massive economic stimulus plan, obviously in the US and globally, to prevent a post-COVID economic depression. How that gets built is going to be critical. It should be built upon the needs of working people. And lastly, we need to be securing our democracies and rebuilding trust in our governments, which is a huge challenge around the world. So quickly in the US, the immediate needs, I think people are seeing all of that, the food banks and the assistance in unemployment, unions are front and center at doing that. We're currently in a debate about the next CARES Act. What's missing from our first round of support in the US? We still do not have a OSHA standard. And this is incredible. The agency charged with ensuring that employers maintain a safe workplace have been absent in this crisis. And so we need to make sure that we are pushing for emergency legislation that was just introduced. We've been fighting for this for a long time, but we need a standard around infectious disease now. We need to be expanding that social contract that Tom mentioned, expand paid sick leave, sick days that were that many workers were left out in the first bill, and of course the issue around immigration. Yesterday we spent a lot of time, I did interviews around this. This administration cannot continue to scapegoat immigrants, and yesterday the announcement of closing off immigration was another example of distracting from the fact that anything that we are building for our economy must protect all of these workers, and especially as it's harvest time in the US, many workers are still coming from Mexico, and the unions are actually right now trying to set up with the growers safe working places and making sure workers coming from Mexico to harvest our food is good. Let me go quickly to global responses. One, we absolutely agree. Today the G20 is meeting, the labor ministers are meeting, and we're calling for the same thing, a robust global new social contract based on what Tom said, social dialogue, fundamental rights, adequate minimum wage, health and safety, including addressing gender-based violence in the workplace, and making sure that there's legislation around collective bargaining, paid sick leave, and CARES leave. Secondly, we need universal social protection. As we speak, we're talking to those labor ministers, and we're asking for the creation of a global fund for social protection. Currently, Europe, Germany, and France are taking this up. No surprise, the US is opposing this, and so we've got work to do. We believe we need $5 billion immediately to support the 28 poorest countries. We need to be investing in the infrastructure, not only of our physical economy, rebuilding roads and bridges, but the care economy as well. And so we have a whole set of policy recommendations around that. And we need to be implementing just transition measures.
We're close on time.
Okay. I'm going to just end by saying that yesterday was announced there was a corporate accountability agreement reached by employers and unions, which I think sets a great framework and a great setup for Ellen's presentation. And we agreed that we need action for garment workers throughout supply chains. And so happy to talk more about that. I think it's a model we'll need going forward, business and workers working together and to address the needs of 150 million workers in supply chains. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wow. You've covered a lot of territory locally and globally. Thank you, Cathy. I also want to say, I'm going to share my screen just for a minute, that Cathy did include some of the linkage to the global labor movement responses to the pandemic. They are in the slide deck as a resource. So thank you, Cathy. We'll now, in parallel, and this is in the spirit of LERA, hear a management perspective. Alan, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for the invitation. So a brief introduction, what a very brief one. So I'm the Director of Global Affairs for the HR Policy Association, which is an association of 400 chief human resource officers, largely American businesses, but all working internationally. Just to balance things off, I was also Chief Human Resources Officer of the International Labor Organization. So, you know, a good buddy of mine is Guy Ryder, who runs the organization at the moment and used to head up ITUC. So, you know, I've been working with companies on coronavirus responses from an employee relations, right, not from a health point of view, for more than four months, because I was heavily involved in employee relations issues for international companies in China. So logically, people turned and said, hey, what's going on in Wuhan? Now, I've written a few guides, and one of them's been published by the International Organization of Employers at the IOE, and you can take a look at that. And you know, over the last 4 months, I think I've been on like 35 multi-employer calls. And the largest one, this one's a great one, but the largest one was like 693 companies. So business is taking COVID-19 extremely seriously and is very worried about it. I mean, my most recent reflection and what I want to talk about today is the coronavirus in business. And I've been challenging companies, and this is where, you know, Tom and where Cathy and I will agree in many respects. And I've been asking companies and CHROs, when we come out of this, how do you want your company to be remembered? And there is an extended version. If you get me on LinkedIn, you can see it, and there's a podcast on there as well. So if you look at a lot of people have talked about the economic crisis of 2008. Now, there are lots of differences, right? The economic crisis of 2008 was not the fault of business, but I think as we look back from 2020 and look at the coronavirus issue, it's very, very clear that the behaviors of businesses during the pandemic will make companies heroes or villains. And in my view, there will be little or no middle ground. So, but let's start in a second with governments, because they sit at the center. So governments have stepped in around the world with two main policy objectives. First, to save lives, and second, to maintain social peace and stability. And third on their list has been business and the economy. And in varying degrees, governments have worked to assure safe working conditions for essential workers and to keep non-essential workers off the streets, and to maintain, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia, a living wage for those people's families who are not working. And governments figure that if they can keep those priorities 1 and 2 together for, say, 2 quarters, then the future for business and the economy will be better and deliver the V-shaped recovery that we hope for, rather than the U-shaped recovery we could end up with if businesses don't behave well. Now, as we look forward, governments have taken controls of the affairs of business in ways that they've not done since World War II. And today they're focused on the now, flattening the curve, ensuring public health needs are met, getting cash into people's hands. And outside of a few countries, China, South Korea, Singapore, more recently this week, Italy, Sweden, and Germany, they've yet to turn their full attention to the business side restart that comes when society reopens. Now, whether they step back and let business get on with the business of business, or see business operating solely in its own interest as a result of behaviors in the crisis, the behavior of companies today will likely shape the regulatory environment on the back end of the pandemic and long into the future. And as Tom said, relook at that social contract. So companies have choices. And put it bluntly, companies can shift their non-essential workers into essential work to cover for increased demand and high absenteeism. They can divert production in their own companies and in their supply chain to delivering the materials that care workers need. They can reinforce networks of employees to support communities. They can offer training to staff at home. They can build up support networks for employers under stress at work and at home. And if you read and listen along the presentation, again, get it on LinkedIn. I would point out to 10 things that companies can and should do. However, companies can lay off workers, cut contracts with gig workers and subcontractors, cancel orders in national and international supply chain, delay giving loans to self-employed, delay payments to the suppliers who've already completed work in order to preserve their own cash flow, and be incommunicative towards their current, recently ex or soon to be ex-employees. And as we've heard from Cathy, we heard from Tom, understandably, the business decisions today are increasing the volume of claims that we've seen. You've heard them. Uneven spread of the disease is evidence of inequality. The lack of effective supply chain due diligence as Bangladesh garment workers go unpaid because US brands renege on purchase agreements. Greater participation in the workplace, insufficient PPE and precautionary measures, demands for universal health care, demands for paid time off, and everyone points to the Business Roundtable's 2019 proclamation that corporate responsibility extends beyond the shareholder. And this is not about theory, it's about real choices, and the returns on these choices will be incalculable. For business, they may not bring consumers or investors to your doorstep today, but your behavior will help influence company reputation and the regulatory framework that secures your ability to compete tomorrow.
And Alan, we're close to time.
Yeah, I'm just about done. So as I say, heroes are going to step forward and protect all shareholders for tomorrow. The villains will step back and protect today's bottom line. So the news is full of great solutions. Schools using 3D printers for masks, runway designers making gowns, local charities delivering food, Formula One workers making ventilators. What they lack and what they need most is what big companies have got, and that's scale. And what I'm trying to do is to say, there are great examples here. Let's see more of this and let companies show and tell what they're doing to support their stakeholders. Villains will cut and run, heroes will inspire. And we're all in this together.
Super. Alan, thank you. On the one hand, Cathy has pointed to fundamental policy issues on the part of government, as well as initiatives on the part of labor. Alan has highlighted fundamental challenges and really chances for companies to step forward, lean forward, and be heroes, not villains. So thank you. I will share my screen again for a moment, just again so that people will know. Alan has included into the slide deck a sort of summary slide of the 10 points that he's highlighted of what companies can do in this crisis. That is available to you as a resource. And I'm going to keep the screen share on a minute as we turn to Sandy Jacoby, who is going to place this in a historical context. Sandy, in a minute, we'll turn back to you speaking, but if you'd like to have me to leave this on, just as you help us to understand that we've faced turning points before in history.
You hear me?
Yes, speak a little louder or come closer to the microphone, but that's great.
Okay. So the question is, are we at a turning point? And everybody is asking, will this crisis lead to better social protection and stronger unions? And I'd like to provide some historical perspective on turning points in the last couple of hundred years. And the first occurred during the early 19th century, when societies in the West moved away from mercantilism and what people call a socially embedded economy to free markets and laissez-faire. Didn't happen automatically. Legislatures repealed earlier protective regulations. Courts refused to enforce customary obligations of employers to their workers. And all that mattered were the terms reached by freely contracting agents. And as laissez-faire took hold, there was a spontaneous reaction to its pernicious effects coming from workers' parties, protests, trade unions. And in Europe, the response was the development of social insurance, which started in Germany. And here in the US, American reformers developed similar legislation, but it didn't make any headway at the federal level. There was an American alternative that was called welfare capitalism. Starting in the 1920s, large companies began offering modest pension plans, some sickness benefits, and more secure jobs. What they wanted was to avoid big government, European style, and strong unions that they associated with European welfare states. So the US was a laggard when it came to social protection, but another turning point came with Roosevelt's New Deal. And here the crown jewels were the Social Security Act, and for us labor types, the National Labor Relations Act. What happened during the Depression and also during the war were that tens of millions of people were stuck in the same leaky boat. And that fostered solidarity with anonymous others. Well, welfare capitalism didn't disappear. It became a second tier of protection that made the United States distinctive, with government as well as employer provision. And after the war, unions expanded this private welfare state with a variety of fringe benefits and better job security. We're reaching another turning point. Comes the 1970s, and the solidarity, the social solidarity produced by the war and depression were fading. We had stagflation. The economists who favored the New Deal and who, by the way, founded LERA were supplanted by a younger cohort of people who were skeptical of regulation. You can call this moment the entry of neo-laissez-faire or neoliberalism, and it was our friend Jimmy Carter who started the deregulatory ball rolling. Ronald Reagan pushed harder. He also introduced Thatcher-style privatization. He couldn't privatize Social Security, but one thing he did that's worth noting was to deregulate in the hospital area and allow the sale of not-for-profit hospitals to private hospital chains. The result was that the number of hospitals and the number of beds declined. Come Bill Clinton, he continued to deregulate markets and cut social spending, but he did take one step towards a stronger safety net, which was the FMLA, which relied on mandates that cost the government nothing. Meanwhile, the second tier deteriorated. Employers shifted onto workers risks that employers had previously insured. Another way employers got out of the risk insurance business was to reclassify employees as independent contractors. And as you know, the exception to this unhappy era, the big exception was the ACA, Obamacare. It's still not perfect. 14 states still don't include Medicaid recipients in the ACA. And Texas alone has 5 million uninsured residents. And then came the pandemic. We've never experienced anything like this 1-2 punch of disease and rapid economic collapse. And I think we're in for the same slow recovery of labor markets that happened after the financial crisis. Scientists say the pandemic will be completely over by early 2022, but we're still going to have millions, maybe tens of millions of adults who will still be jobless by then, still. What happens when they're free to leave their homes? Right now, the news is filled with stories of human kindness, but gratitude has its limits. It won't reverse inequality. It doesn't provide better jobs. To get those things, we need new political coalitions, stronger unions, and most of all, we need to replace selfishness with collective consciousness. I'm almost done. Are we at another turning point? The country remains divided. The fault lines are familiar: race and values, geography. And come November, we'll see whether the sharing of economic and health risks can bridge those fault lines. Wilma Liebman steered me to a study in the New York Times, reported in the New York Times, that surveyed a group of people on 2 dates, March 18th and April 2nd. And what it found was that between those dates, there was a small but significant increase in the number of respondents who put at least as much weight on society's interests as on their own. So whether or not we see another great transformation is going to depend on the willingness of Americans to widen the circle of we. Done.
Super. Thank you, Sandy. And needless to say, that sets the stage, Wilma, for some concluding comments in terms of not only what happens during the crisis, but what happens beyond.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to my colleagues for great presentations. As Sandy has just described, a glance back in history would suggest that this pandemic crisis could be a moment for a great transformation, an opportunity to come out stronger, or not. On one view, America will not return to the pre-virus status quo. Americans' feelings about government will be transformed as they realize how important it is that government can do its job well to create security and opportunity, and as they see what the virus has exposed. Economic injustices and weaknesses that were prevalent even before are now placed in bold relief and exacerbated. The pernicious effects of decades of declining worker power and stagnant wages are laid bare. In a powerful article in The Atlantic, which I recommend, written by George Packer, he writes, "We are living in a failed state. The virus didn't break America, it revealed what was already broken." On another view, the crisis may turn out to be less of a turning point than many predict. In a year or so, we may be back where we started, with the weaknesses and injustices we had before, with attitudes about government just as divided and entrenched. It is possible that people will view this COVID-19 debacle as an affirmation of pre-existing views about government, those who view the government and public goods as having an important role to play, solidifying their beliefs, and those who are skeptical of government having their views confirmed. Similarly with views about global governance. And the jury is out on which of these views will be correct. Indeed, with poverty and misery on the rise, things could even get worse, turning on many unknowns. The path of the virus, how long enforced confinement continues, the ultimate global economic impact, the likelihood of political and social turbulence, resentment, backlash, and growing authoritarianism. The urgent question then is, how do we seize this moment to ensure a more secure and equal future? We've read and today heard dynamic and persuasive prescriptions for the kinds of structural change that are needed, but how do we create the political will? We cannot divorce this pandemic crisis from the surrounding political arena, and especially from nasty election year politics. There are powerful forces underway to catalyze anti-government resentment and hostility, as the recent protests against lockdowns in several states reveal, especially the portrayal of restrictions as draconian measures to shut down rural America because of New York City, with all that entails. An irony from this crisis was the very cynical invocation of Rosa Parks to protest interference with basic liberties. After the economic crisis of 2008, many saw an opening for a New Deal. Of course, that never happened. Instead, we got the Tea Party. But is the growing activism of the last few years enough to avoid that happening this time? The results of a recent survey that Sandy just mentioned would imply otherwise. They suggest a surprising paradox. The pandemic has increased Americans' feelings of solidarity, but it has also increased their acceptance of inequalities due to luck. So ongoing shifts in attitude may cancel each other out. There are no easy answers, but at a minimum, isn't a tripartite social dialogue on these competing views urgently needed to transcend the toxic divide that poisons our society and our public discourse? A dialogue with labor, business, and government at the table is quite foreign in the US. Labor has not been accepted as an equal, entitled to sit at the table, except perhaps during world wars. But isn't this such a moment? We must also provide a persuasive narrative and strategy to counter anti-government philosophy. It would be a mistake to assume that the public will naturally see the benefits in a country with a strong safety net and public health infrastructure. We also can't assume that the crisis will naturally validate the views of those who see government as a social good, or the important role for the stronger global institutions and multilateral cooperation. Two other things this crisis has put in high relief: the important role played by local government leaders, mayors, and many governors in securing the safety and security of their communities, as well as the critical role played in this health crisis by global multilateral organizations. And so my final point is, I don't have all the answers to how we make this happen, but certainly the process for creating the political will to achieve a better future, in other words, is critical to achieving that goal. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Wilma. First of all, I want to commend all of the panelists for putting some well-posed and crucial points on the table. In the spirit of this webinar, we're going to open it up to dialogue with the members. We have over 278 people on board. And what I'm going to do is ask you to click on the participant icon, which lets you have the option of doing what's called hand raising. If you raise your hand, I will call on you and I'll take 5 or 6 comments. I'm writing them down on a slide, which I'll share with you in a minute. And then we'll let the panelists select from among the menu of choices to make some additional comments. I see, and not all names are listed, but we'll go with what's listed as Durftop and then Ben Kreider.
Thank you. So in terms of progress made by labor, it's usually been done in the context of in-person organization. But what do you think that organization looks like given social distancing, stay at home, and current events?
Nice. And I appreciate a crisp question because we do want to hear from as many as possible. Ben.
Sure. I'm wondering what role you think alternative organizations have to play versus labor unions, alternative work organizations, in terms of pushing for these collective structural changes you mentioned.
Good. Second question then is, what is the role of worker centers and other alternative organizations in this context? Great. Jeff. And Jeff, you're muted. While you're looking to unmute, I'm going to shift to Teresa Ghilardarchi.
Hi, what will happen when companies emerge to be stronger oligopolies, stronger monopolies, and stronger monopsonies? What will be the prospects for labor?
Good. Thank you, Teresa. Jeff, are you ready?
Yes. Short term, I think we face some very serious challenges in the public sector, just funding the post office and also making sure that the states that have carried the burden of providing health services are going to get adequate funding. Longer term, I can see that running these massive deficits, we may wind up shredding what minimum social safety net that we've constructed in terms of providing Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. I'm not sure we have the sufficient forces to push back, but I would like to get other people's perspective on that.
Super. So the question is, what happens to safety nets when we have massive deficits? Excellent. Jeff Wheeler.
Yeah.
And you'll need to unmute. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. Oh, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, my question is, are there any success stories that you can point to for labor? Looking at the healthcare industry, looking at teachers in schools. So I'm wondering if we have good models that we can look at and work from.
Good. Let me take 1 or 2 more. Asaf Bondi.
Thank you. Some of you mentioned the relative success of European countries in dealing with the economic and social consequences of the crisis. And I wonder what are the prospect or chances for labor and employers cooperation in order to promote these models of success or relative success that we see in many European states, like short-time work and others? Thank you.
Super. So what I'm going to suggest is, first of all, let me pause here and just share my screen so you can all see the questions that have been asked so far. We have a series of excellent points and questions. The first two I took from the chat, which is, are we going to a multi-party rather than just a tri-party framework? There's also a metaphor: when the water hole shrinks, animals look at each other differently. That's kind of a storm cloud on the horizon. We have the whole issue of what happens with in-person organizing, as well as the role of worker centers and alternative organizations. On the other side, emerging oligopolies and monopolies, as well as the issue of safety nets and deficits. Are there success stories, and can we learn from models in the EU? Excuse me. And what I'm going to do is turn to the panelists in the same order that we presented. So we'll go with Tom, then Cathy, then Alan, then Sandy, and then Wilma. And you can take one or two of these questions that you want to address. And of course, you can also comment on each other's comments. Go ahead, Tom, you get to go first.
Thanks, Joel. Great questions. Yes to the number one. It's labor, business, government. I would certainly add in the education sector. And when we talk about labor today, we're talking about a very diverse, but I hope unified group of women and minorities and people from the worker advocacy community, as well as the labor movement as we've known it. That coalition is so important to bring their voices together in unison to this process. So maybe it's more than tripartite, it's multipartite, but I think those groups have to come together. On the business side too, there's diversity in terms of entrepreneurs and small businesses, and not just the big business. So that isn't just, as Teresa worries correctly, that it's going to be more oligopoly dominated. The last point I want to make is about the examples of innovation. I believe that we're seeing both advocacy groups like coworkers.com helping to raise the voices of individuals up in their organizations where there is no formal representation, and other groups like that. I just know of that one in particular, but there are many groups like that. And then in the labor movement, we're seeing, for example, in the state of Washington, the governor called on the healthcare unions, SEIU, AFSCME, the nurses associations, and others to work with the hospital associations, their individual employers, and we will send you a summary of some of the negotiated agreements that they put in place for backup childcare, for redeploying people to where the greatest needs are, for premium pay, for safety provisions. There they are demonstrating that with leadership from a sensible governor who sees the value of bringing labor and management together and leads them and challenges them to add value together, there's real progress. So I think we're seeing some innovations, and we're seeing some leading companies, as Alan mentioned, but I also see the potential of bringing these various complementary forms of worker voice together, with the labor movement perhaps being the umbrella that helps make it all happen.
Super. Thank you, Tom. Cathy, do you need the list up, or do you want to just dive right in?
I think I'll just dive right in. There's so many great questions. Let me start with ones that haven't been covered. Online organizing. I think that's going to be key. The AFL-CIO has built Action Builder, which was an app for organizing that unions themselves have built. It's a nonprofit. We're looking to expand that. We've already heard from some of the hospitality workers. Now is the time to, if you have 90% of layoffs in some of your workplaces, we need new ways of contacting workers. And so we're looking to using Action Builder and other apps. We're also looking to take that globally. Let me move to the worker center question. I'm a fan of saying it's one big continuum. And it's really not, divided up in that way. We are part of a labor, one big labor movement. Let me give you two good examples, I think, for the current moment. In Minneapolis, here Local 17 is working with Tetul, Rock, and the city of Minneapolis, and they've developed a Twin Cities Hospitality Fund focusing on information, services, crisis management, and micro grants. You have the same thing happening in Louisiana with Stand Up Louisiana, where the hospitality workers in Unite Here, some of their organizers who've been laid off are going to work with Progressive Stand Up Louisiana. So I think it's really a great model that, this is one big movement that we need to continue to be building together. I would I guess I'll quickly talk about the EU, and if I could also do oligopoly, but I'll do the EU models. Absolutely. In 2008, my favorite story is the head of the German labor movement, the DGB, came to talk to the Federal Reserve, and I was in that meeting, and he said, what happens in your country? You lay people off, they eat junk food, and they get depressed. I mean, he says this at the Fed. And, and he said, what do we Germans do? We have short-term work arrangements. We keep people going. We train them. Workers negotiated and gave time back from their vacation time. And Volkswagen kept them, getting trained. And look at our model. And I think you are absolutely right to ask that question. Without social dialogue, it is hard to get to those very good places. So Tom, I am so on your page. I've been fighting this forever. We need social dialogue right now in this country. It will help us rebuild. Look at what Germany's doing when you come together. And I would just say the labor movements are growing in some countries in Europe. The Swedes are reporting a growth in membership, as are some of the other European countries, because workers see now's not the time to be alone. So thank you for your questions.
Wow. Alan. Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, okay, so let's take a look at multi-stakeholder. When we come out of this, the way that we've behaved, whether it's business or trade unions or governments, will be judged by public opinion, and there are multiple stakeholders in this. And I think we come to a breaking point here, which is something that I've been talking about for a long time. For maybe 200 years, the voice of trade unions and the voice of workers has been synonymous, right? The ILO is built on that fundamental view. That said, when we look at today's social era, this is not the case. I mean, workers have got a lot of choices on how to mobilize individual and collective voice, and companies and governments have lots of different ways of listening and responding. And I don't think there's any way that we can go forward without a multi-stakeholder view. And I would reverse the question that was put in is, building trade union success through face-to-face engagement. My argument would be that trade unions have lost influence because they haven't adopted approaches other than face-to-face engagement. And Cathy is right that the growth and influence of trade unions is going to depend on the utilization of social networks and dealing with young people as potential members in the way that those people want to be dealt with. I mean, just very briefly, monopoly, oligopoly, the interesting thing is, I think what we see around the world is kind of a hollowing out. We see big monopolies, we see oligopolies, but we also see those businesses spawning huge numbers of small enterprises. And if there is one thing that I think we need to fix, this is the question of subcontract workers, small businesses, and gig economy workers. And the sooner that we get to realize that there are entrepreneurs, there are employees, and there are other workers, and those other workers deserve some basic minimum provisions and protections, and they don't deserve to be left on the side because they are a part of the future. And I worry coming out that a whole bunch of that will be destroyed. If we look at the EU, I mean, I honestly think fundamentally what the European Union countries have done is subsidize workers' pay at between like 75 and 87%, depending on which company you go to, in order to continue the contract of employment with those individuals, so that when we turn round, they already have a continuing relationship with the company in which they work for. The US, now I've lived in the US for the last 10 years and moved last year to the UK, but this notion that you throw away workers destroy the relationship with the company and then hope that they're going to come back engaged into the future. I'm depressed to say I think the US comes out of this slower and worse off than Europe, because what's going to happen is all of those millions of workers that are unemployed, as companies come out, they will come out at different paces. We know the hospitality industry comes out last. Maybe manufacturing businesses, parts of it come out first. And so what we're going to see is that companies are going to be struggling, having let their workers go, saying, hey, I'm now in an open game. I can now compete for better people than I used to have. And rather than getting our resources into place quickly, we're going to be squabbling in a dysfunctional labor market to come out. So, I really hope American exceptionalism works, but my feeling is that Europe is going to come out of this stronger than the US.
Wow. Thank you, Alan. Sandy.
Well, the only thing I would say is that things are going to change. Things will change. There's no question that after social shock like this, we are going to see changes. But it's going to take a long time for the economic recovery to take hold. I see a prolonged period of unemployment and very slow growth. And I think we have to be thinking about that issue of what supports will there be for low-income, unemployed workers who are going to be without jobs for several years. And what I would put on the table is public service employment. We haven't had that in a long time. And we had it in the 70s. We had it during World War II. We had it in the 30s. And I think that that's, from where I am, I'm going to just put that one policy proposal on the table. We desperately need that.
Super, thank you. We have still a little bit of time. Wilma, do you have a response to the questions that are posed? And in addition, there are a couple more questions that are coming in, both in the chat and the hand raising. I'll just mention them before turning to you, Wilma. We had a question from David Jacobs to say that the institutions matter, but it is unfortunately the case that undemocratic features at the federal level may undercut potential collective action across states. We also have a set of questions about the reduced bargaining power of older workers and the lower capacity that they will have in the labor market coming out of this, as well as a number of other questions. And by the way, all of the questions in chat will be added to the slide deck afterwards so that we won't lose any comments that people have made. But let me turn it back to you, Wilma.
Oh, thank you. I probably shouldn't be the last person to close this out, because while naturally I tend to be an optimist, and I think optimism is important, otherwise it the negative views become self-fulfilling. I am skeptical, however. I think some of the questions reveal the profound challenges that we face, the staggering ramifications of this crisis. In fact, ramifications come into view every day that you hadn't even thought of the day before. But just very briefly, I do think that some form of social dialogue will be essential in this country. Again, it's far into our culture, but I think it's essential. I'd be happy with tripartism. And if we could manage tripartism, I guess we could manage multipartism, but tripartism would be good. If we could really have a business community that adheres to what Alan Wilde is talking about in terms of corporate accountability, corporate responsibility, caring about being the hero instead of the villain, I think that would be great. And it would achieve a lot in moving the dialogue. And if labor could come together and agree on what their goals are going forward, I think there are models in the New Deal, certainly the public works projects that Sandy talks about, very critical to getting the economy working again. And labor at the same time could be doing more, I suppose, right now to organize the unemployed, again, following a model from the Depression. I think what Teresa raises, the threats of consolidation are very real. I don't know how to deal with them, certainly in the 1 minute remaining. But again, I would say we have lots of good ideas. Tom raised them, Alan raised them, Cathy raised them, really good, dynamic, solid proposals for a way forward. I think the challenge that we face, and again, I don't mean to repeat myself, but particularly in a nasty political elections season, how do we figure out how to bridge these divides and move the dialogue forward?
Thank you. In a minute, I'm going to actually turn to Tom to set the stage for the rest of the sessions in the series. But I really want to commend and appreciate this whole panel. You've really represented the spirit of LERA in providing different perspectives, but all of which point to this being a pivotal moment in history and highlighting the opportunity to lead with innovation and change rather than just a snapback to normal or worse. As we look ahead to the rest of the series, Tom, this whole idea was first prompted by you. We have a great set of 7 weeks of panels, some days with 2 of them at a time, diving in on interest sections, on industry councils, and on local chapters. Any kind of final word to launch them into the continued dialogue that LERA will be hosting?
I think the power of the ideas that were expressed here today and the questions in the faces and names I see out there, that's where the innovation is going to come from. These webinars are a vehicle for us to get our voices out there, to think about them, to take these recordings out to the public, to our communities, to our local chapters. As Wilma said, this is a political process. We may not all speak specifically with the same voice, but we speak from a set of common values and principles of dialogue, of respect for all of the people who work and the people who employ our workforce. And so let's take the power of LERA out to the public. These webinars are a great opportunity to participate in the ones coming forward, but use this. Let's not just limit it to the 200 or so folks here. Everyone who has access will have access to these materials. There is a recording. Let's take this to the media. Let's take this to our communities. Let's host gatherings on Zoom with groups outside, and let's see if we can be true to our LERA heritage and lead the next new transformation in this country. So I want to particularly thank our organizers from the LERA staff and Joel for an excellent, as always, job of moderating. So let's go to work.
Super. Please join me in a virtual clapping of hands and saying thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. LERA will curate this into a series of video clips that will be on their website. Those of you who are registered, LERA has your email addresses, and we will take what's in the chat, add it to the slide deck, and circulate the slides back to all of you. And we encourage your participation in the rest of the webinars in the series. Thank you. Thank you all, and take good care.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you and goodbye.